What's going on, everybody? Andrew Edwards here, editor-in-chief of GearLive.com. Apple dropped iOS 14.3, and as part of 14.3, you have Apple Fitness Plus. You have support for the new AirPods Max. I have videos coming on those two things very soon, but another major feature happening is the launch of ProRAW. And I figured, why not bring in someone who is quite honestly better than me in every way as it pertains to not just photography, but raw photography in particular. He is the co-founder and designer of the Halide Camera App. He also shares some of the most impressive iPhone photography that you'll see anywhere on his Twitter feed at SDW. Sebastiaan DeWitt, how are you doing today, sir?
Hey, Andrew. Nice to be here. Thanks for the awesome intro.
Absolutely. Hey, man, some of the things you capture are incredible. And obviously, I mean, you're the maker of one of the, in my opinion, the best pro camera app on the App Store. So it would make sense that this is kind of your forte.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yes. So let's talk about ProRAW in particular. I want to focus on the average consumer, the average buyer of the iPhone, not someone who is, deep into photography, but is more a hobbyist or like a prosumer, as I mentioned. So iOS 14.3 brings ProRAW to the iPhone 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max in particular. No other phones in the lineup, which I mean, kind of indicates to me that the buyers of those devices are more of the prosumer and less of the average consumer, the person who might just buy, the typical iPhone 12. If you're unaware, Apple says that ProRAW gives you the standard info of a raw image combined with the processing of Apple's imaging pipeline. So things like noise reduction and multi-frame exposure adjustments are in place, letting you get to work on things like optimizing the white balance and colors. But when I look at that description, the first thing I think is if I were showing this to the average person on the street, they might look at that and say, wait a minute, back up. What even is RAW in the first place? What is that? So I want to start there. What is the RAW format and why should people care?
Yeah, totally. And it's a great question. I think this is also why Apple's probably actually requiring you to go into settings on your new shiny 12 Pro, and you have to actually enable it to even see the toggle. It's not just going to be there suddenly when you install it. You have to go into settings, camera, and then ProRAW has to be enabled for the little toggle to show up. And basically, since cameras got a lot smarter in the last couple of years, especially the ones in your iPhone, they take a lot of photos at the same time, and they kind of combine them to get the best possible shot out of it. That's really great. We obviously get better and better images out of it. Since D11, we got that cool night mode, unless you shoot in the dark.
Yep.
But it also means that your camera's going to have to take a few creative decisions for you. So if it sees like kind of what the color looks like in your shot, like sometimes you've seen this happen during like a sunset where the light is very orange and your camera can't really figure out if that's the way it's supposed to look, or there's just times where your camera basically has to make a snap decision for you what your picture has to end up looking like, whether that is it's lighter or darker, or this is in focus or that's in focus. There's some flexibility lost when you take your photo because those decisions are being made as it's captured. Now, RAW files basically give you more of the raw image that your sensor saw, what the camera saw, before a lot of those decisions were applied in a way that doesn't let you go back again. And you kind of we have a long deep dive coming out to kind of explain how RAW files work, but basically you have to imagine that it allows you to do a lot more editing. So if that's something you like to do, if you like to take your image and fine tune it after the fact, that's where the RAW file really shines.
So Apple could have added standard RAW, an option to the stock Photos app years ago if they wanted to. They never did. You've always had to download a third-party app to shoot RAW with an iPhone. What is it about ProRAW that you're seeing that makes it, for lack of a better term, Apple-y enough to put into the stock camera app finally?
Yeah, totally. It's one of those things where you see this mentioned a lot on tech blogs, right? Where people say, Apple's pretending like this is the first time anyone's ever done this, but this has been out there for years. Yes. And that definitely applies to RAW too. Halide, our app, has been able to take RAW files for a couple of years now, but ProRAW is doing it a little differently. And the reason for that is if you look at the way iPhones capture photos nowadays, they do it with all these special computational smarts. So they take a photo by combining a bunch of photos instantly to bring out a bit more detail in the shadows and the highlights. It scans it with a neural network to see which parts are faces and retains details in that and make sure that they're exposed right. Our RAW files right now, when people take a RAW file with Halide, they see that it's kind of noisy and it can be a little brighter or darker, or honestly, they don't look very good. And that's because a RAW file, as it is, has to be edited to look good. You have to put in the work. It's raw. You don't get all those extra cool computational smarts. And Apple decided that wasn't good enough for them, and they were going to make a custom format. Well, that's not a custom format, it's a standard file format, but a custom type of RAW that actually has all that smart stuff built in, and you get a really nice file to work with some of those cool computational smarts.
Okay, so if someone has an app like Halide, is there a situation where you would want to still shoot in non-ProRAW, but standard RAW versus ProRAW, or is ProRAW just it now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is. And that's coming from someone, admittedly, who has been shooting a lot of RAW on his iPhone already, so I know and love the RAW files and I know what they can do. If you really know how to edit RAW files, then you can still get a bit more detail out of normal RAW files, because Apple, because of the way it has to combine images to make those ProRAW files, still applies noise reduction. And it's not like the iPhone XS. Some people can remember the iPhone XS had some kind of aggressive noise reduction. It looked a little smudgy, you know, and especially dark places can lose some detail. It's not quite that, you know. ProRAW is only on the iPhone 12 Pro and the Pro Max, so you get a really good camera. But you will see that sometimes you get a bit more detail out of a normal RAW file at the expense of seeing some noise. I also have to mention that ProRAWs capture fairly slowly. In Halide, it can take 1 to 2 seconds to get that ProRAW shot. In the standard camera app, can be a little faster, but in reality, you know, you're not shooting fast. Normal RAW files capture pretty quick.
Okay, looking at the average consumer, not the seasoned photographer, if someone sees this or reads about the feature and they want to try it out, it's the first time they've taken a RAW photo in their life, what situations lend themselves really well to the format? Or in other words, when would the average person want to enable ProRAW for an image they're about to take? What is in their viewfinder?
I think a great situation for ProRAW is the type of challenging lighting that would normally make you feel like maybe your camera can't even really capture what you're seeing. So take someone being backlit, for instance. Being backlit or having challenging color light can be one of those times where you feel like, you know what, I'm gonna take this picture, it's just not really gonna come out the way I see it. The magic of ProRAW especially is that there's so much detail in that shot that later on you can edit it and really get that level of detail out of, like, maybe the shadows when someone is backlit, or maybe the highlights when there's too much light behind them. You can push those things up or down and still get a lot out of it. Another time where it's really fun to play with is when there's lots of different kinds of colored light going on, and if you change the tone of that light, obviously usually all the other colors kind of start looking unnatural. With RAW, you can more easily push the colors to look different while still remaining natural. Everything kind of harmonizes along with all of that.
And then you mentioned when you shoot RAW, you're shooting with the intention of editing your photo to make it look better later. For the average person, again, out there, they're not seasoned, they've never done this before. If it's your first time editing, what are some guidance you can give? What apps do you use? What apps do you like? And when you see all these sliders and settings and knobs and dials, where do you start in these apps without getting overwhelmed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. These kind of files have a lot of flexibility in them. So, you know, there's a few situations in which you really want to capture RAW files and get the most out of them. And a situation like that, let's take an example. You know, I'm out and shooting someone against like a setting sun during a sunset. I both want to really change the colors to make it look like the sunset was happening, and I want to get a lot of detail out of those shadows. So a good place to start, if you're on an iPhone, is an app like Darkroom. I think they have an update on the way for ProRAW and Pixelmator Photo. These are two great apps by great developers, independent developers just like ourselves. And if you drop into an app like that, to really see the power of ProRAW, try to fiddle with the shadow and highlight sliders first, because previously, if you got a photo and you were just editing it like an Instagram, you might have thought, well, that's just shadow, there's no detail there, it's just dark. Now you'll find if you dial that slider up, really gun it, like really push it all the way, there's a lot of detail there. Sometimes you can make stuff appear that you didn't even see. And the same thing goes for highlights. If something looks blown out and too bright, sometimes you could push past what you think is just gone. It's just white. No, there's stuff there. There's all that detail in the RAW file. And then there's color. Like You can adjust white balance, so that tint, that color temperature that you know, the sort of blue or yellow tint in your shot. You can change that, and now you'll see that the colors kind of harmonize with that. They don't just kind of end up looking unnatural. That's because RAW files capture so much extra color information that if you change the color temperature of your shot, there's enough information to kind of change all the other colors along with it, so it still looks natural. Really, really cool to play with.
Okay, and then alternatively, when would you not want to tap on that ProRAW setting to enable it?
If I say all these things about there being so much more detail in RAW files, you might think, oh well, there's just no reason not to shoot RAW. But there's a lot of times where you can't even really shoot RAW. For instance, even if whether you use Halide or the normal Apple Camera App, you can't combine RAW with live photos, for instance, which honestly I love RAW, like live photos as well as taking RAW photos, because you can sometimes get a lot when there's a lot of action going on. And action is where ProRAW doesn't really work unless you can like really time your shot perfectly. ProRAW takes a few seconds to capture. You can't really keep mashing that capture button. In Halide, we block it. In the native camera app, I think you can take maybe 2 or 3 shots until it starts like locking you out of taking photos. There's no burst or anything. Portrait mode doesn't work with RAW, so there's still some situations where you may not want to take a RAW file. I also have to say ProRAW files especially are huge. We're talking a normal photo being between 1 to 2 megabytes. ProRAW files can be 20 to 40 megabytes. So we're talking 10, 20 times bigger. That's going to fill your iPhone up pretty quick. Even if the iPhone 12 Pro, which you need to have ProRAW, starts at 128 gigs, you can fill that up so fast if you only shoot ProRAW files. So that's something to be mindful of.
Okay, so let's talk about Halide for a minute. So one thing I want to say about Halide, again, this is the Pro Camera app that you make, that you build. Halide lets you take RAW photos on any iPhone that is supported by the app. So if you don't have a 12 Pro or Pro Max and you want to try just standard RAW, Halide's the way to go. But you guys did put out a new update today. Tell me about Halide. What should people know about this app?
Yeah, so a little bit about Halide. Me and my friend Ben started Halide because we're both 2 friends that love photography and iPhones and Apple technology. And so when we first got together about 3 years ago, we talked about just making a camera app because we didn't really like any of the camera apps that were out there. Everything out there was just really complicated, and we wanted to make something that kind of sits between the Apple Camera App and those super advanced things. So it's not too crazy, not too many settings. You don't have to always pop into manual. So it's kind of something that has the flexibility that a pro would want. So we do have a full manual mode. You can switch between file formats and set a custom white balance if you want to. But if you don't know what the words shutter speed or ISO mean, it's still a really good solution to start to figure out how photography works and tweaking a few things. Like maybe you want to manually focus, or maybe you just want all your controls to be under your thumb, or you just want to get a little bit more out of your camera. That's where Halide really shines, and that's kind of how we built it. And surprisingly enough, even though we made it for really ourselves, we didn't expect it to just become something big because there were a lot of camera apps already out there. It did really well, and so we're really committed to it now. We're full-time.
Tell me about ProRAW Plus. That was the one that stood out to me when I saw, here's the update. ProRAW Plus, they've already taken ProRAW, which just came out today, and apparently made it even better.
Yeah, so ProRAW just came out, but we were able to test it in the beta for a while. And when we saw it being announced, we were really excited because most people would probably think, oh no, this is going to cut into your app. And Apple takes RAW files now in the camera app, and like you don't need other camera apps anymore. But that's not really true. There's a lot of reasons why you would still want to shoot with an app like Halide. One of the things, of course, is manual control. You can really fine-tune your exposure. You can decide that you want a bit more control in addition to wanting that better file format to shoot in. But another reason is a lot of apps don't support RAW files yet. Instagram doesn't support ProRAW out of the gate, so if you try to share a ProRAW file, it just won't let you. So we, by default, shoot ProRAW Plus, which creates a JPEG file and a ProRAW file. So any app on your iPhone that doesn't support RAW files automatically grabs that JPEG file. It actually saves it as one photo in like your Photos app or and the other app, it doesn't show up as like 2 images or anything like that. And you automatically, you know, if an app supports RAW, it'll grab the RAW file. If it doesn't, it ends up in a JPEG. We also looked at the giant files that were coming out of your ProRAW camera, and we decided to see if we could make a bit of a trade-off there for still having a lot of editing freedom, but reducing the file size a little bit. So Halide offers a 10-bit capture option versus 12-bit, which reduces the quality of your file a little bit. So like if you're recovering shadows, there might be a bit less recovery there, but you still get almost all the quality of a ProRAW file at about half the file size. So that's something we really wanted to build in there. And then there's still times where you want to shoot regular RAW. So we enable you now to quickly choose between what kind of format you want to capture by just like long pressing on the format button to choose between ProRAW plus JPEG or regular native RAW. And that's just kind of a few of the things we've done in the first day one ProRAW release. But we're looking at a lot of stuff in the future to keep building better tools, because it seems like with a format like this, Apple's getting pretty serious about providing great tools for photographers, and we're right there with them.
And just to be clear though, it is less information than a ProRAW, but still way more information than your typical non-RAW iPhone photo.
Yeah, with bit depth reduction, you still get a ton of extra information, and it skips a lot of the steps that make JPEGs so much harder to edit. So you can still fully edit your white balance, for instance. You still get a ton of detail into shadows. You still skip a lot of steps like sharpening and flattening of your image, and it gives you most of the flexibility and still gives you amazing files to work with, but they're just a lot smaller. Compared to head-to-head, 12-bit files can be a lot nicer to work with just because there is that much more color data in them. But for most purposes, for me, I find 10-bit to be totally workable.
And obviously I'm not the expert here, that's why I have you joining me. What did I not ask you? What do people need to know about this feature that I wasn't even informed enough to pull out of you?
I think one of the coolest things about RAW on iPhone and like ProRAW on iPhone is that now people can go out and take photos, and it enables a kind of creative explosion. And I mean that in a way where you can start looking at photography completely differently. If you go out now and you are overlooking the city at a sunset, the way you see that shot, that is something that is very subjective. And we always struggle with our camera kind of like being able to capture that. Like there is a beauty about sunsets and there's a beauty about certain scenes where if your camera is taking the creative choices for you, like it is with a JPEG, you're inherently very limited in expressing or capturing what you're experiencing in that moment. With RAW, I think people can start playing with way more flexibility in editing, way more creative edits, and that will enable people to see that if you take a photo, you can now really creatively express what it looked like. And that can be really subjective. It can be like bringing out the warmth or the shadows in a shot that otherwise would not be able to have that kind of color expose, and bringing out shadows and detail so people in your iPhone photo can see just how detailed and beautiful the scene looked to you. I think that is going to be really cool. And no matter where you lie on the spectrum, whether you're pretty advanced in photography or a complete novice, just having that ability and allowing, casual users to explore the power of something like RAW and the power of expression through just the standard Photos app and the standard Camera app is huge. And I think as people I really encourage people to start experimenting with that, because once you see that what's available to you in these files and what you can edit out of them, it's really, really cool.
If that doesn't make you want to get out and start shooting, I don't know what does. Sebastiaan, thank you so much. Let people know where they can find you, where they can find out more about Halide, etc.
Yeah, so I'm Sebastiaan, the With. So my initials are my handle everywhere. You can find me and see a few samples of ProRAW files I've shot recently on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is just @SDW there. And I help make Halide and the Halide apps Twitter handle is Halide Camera, Halide Camera. So give us a check out and do share your shots if you take any good ones.
So there you have it, guys. That is your overview of Apple's new ProRAW feature, available right now in iOS 14.3 on the iPhone 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. Let me know what you think if you try it out. Let me know if you try out Halide, my favorite pro camera app. Thanks so much for watching. As always, guys, I appreciate your support. I'm Andrew Edwards, and I'll catch you in the next video.